The space station Nova 17 was a place of trade, diplomacy, and secrets. Ships from all across the galaxy came and went, carrying goods, information, and sometimes people with nowhere else to go. Among the travelers, no one noticed the small, thin alien girl wandering through the metal corridors. Or rather, they noticed her, but chose to turn away. Her name was Karen, and she was alone. She had been on this station for days, moving from one section to another, searching for food, shelter, and kindness. She found none. The other species whispered when they saw her. Some stepped away as if touching her would bring bad luck. Others simply ignored her. Karen was Xilari, a species once respected but now hated. The war had changed everything. The Xilari had fought on the losing side, and when the war ended, they were blamed for the destruction. Entire planets turned against them. Those who survived were either hunted down or forced into hiding. Karen had been left behind, just a child when the war ended. Now she was nothing more than a ghost, surviving on scraps and sleeping in cold, empty storage rooms when no one was looking. But today, she was too weak to keep going. Her body trembled as she clutched her thin arms. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. The air on Nova 17 was cold, and her kind was not built for such environments. She sat against the wall in a busy marketplace, watching people pass by. Aliens of all shapes and sizes. Some had 4 arms, some had glowing eyes, others floated instead of walked. But they all had one thing in common. None of them cared. She lowered her head, trying to stop her stomach from hurting. Just then, a pair of heavy boots stopped in front of her. "Hey, kid," the voice said. Karen flinched and looked up. Standing before her was a human. She had seen a few of them on the station, but none had ever spoken to her. This one was tall, with broad shoulders and a scar running down his right cheek. He wore a dark brown jacket, and a heavy bag was slung over his shoulder. His name was Daniel Graves, though she didn't know that yet. He crouched down to her level and frowned. "You all right?" Karen didn't answer. She wasn't sure if this was a trick. Many had spoken to her before, only to push her away or laugh at her. She pulled her knees closer to her chest. Daniel sighed. "You look like you haven't eaten in a while." He reached into his bag and pulled out a food pack. It was a simple meal, protein bars, and a water bottle. He placed them on the ground in front of her. Karen stared at the food, then at him. "Go on," he said. "It won't bite." Her hand shook as she grabbed the food pack. She hesitated for only a second before tearing it open and eating as fast as she could. The taste didn't matter, only that it filled her empty stomach. The water was cold, and she drank too quickly, coughing a little. Daniel watched her, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he asked, "Where are your people?" Karen froze. Her people? She barely remembered them. They had left, or maybe they were dead. She didn't know. All she knew was that she had been alone for a long time. She lowered her head and whispered, "Gone." Daniel's jaw tightened. He glanced around the marketplace. No one else was paying attention to them. The station security didn't care. The merchants didn't care. Nobody cared, except him. After a long pause, he sighed and stood up. "All right," he said. "Come on." Karen blinked. "What?" He gestured with his head. "You can't stay here, kid. You'll freeze before morning." She stared at him in disbelief. No one had ever offered her anything except disgust. But this human, this stranger, was telling her to follow him. She hesitated. Could she trust him? Daniel saw the doubt in her eyes and shrugged. "I'm not gonna force you. But if you come with me, you'll have food and a warm place to sleep." Karen clutched the empty food wrapper in her small hands. Her heart pounded. She had been alone for so long. Was this a trap? Or was this her only chance? Slowly, shakily, she stood up. Daniel gave a small nod. "All right, let's go." And for the first time in a long time, Karen didn't feel completely alone. Karen followed the human through the crowded space station, her small feet struggling to keep up with his long strides. She clutched the empty food wrapper in her trembling hands, still unsure if this was a mistake. Was she walking into another trap? Would he turn on her like the others had? But Daniel Graves didn't look back at her with suspicion or disgust. He simply walked, his shoulders relaxed but his eyes sharp, scanning the station as if he was always ready for danger. Karen had heard about humans before. They were unpredictable, known for their stubbornness and loyalty. Some species called them reckless. Others called them dangerous. But right now, this human was the only one who had stopped for her. After a few minutes, they reached a quieter section of the station. The metal walls were covered in rust, and flickering lights buzzed above them. This was not the place where the rich and powerful stayed. Daniel stopped in front of a small door and pressed a code into the panel. The door slid open with a soft hiss. He stepped inside and gestured for Karen to follow. She hesitated for just a moment before stepping in. The room was small and simple. A bed was pushed against the wall, a table sat in the corner, and a few bags were stacked near the door. There were no decorations, no personal items. It felt like a place someone stayed only because they had nowhere else to go. Daniel tossed his bag onto the table and stretched. Not much, but it's better than sleeping on the floor outside. Karen stood near the door, unsure what to do. She had never been inside someone's home before. Daniel noticed her hesitation and sighed. "You can sit. I'm not gonna bite." Slowly, Karen moved to the edge of the bed and sat down. The mattress was thin, but it was softer than the cold metal floor she was used to. Daniel grabbed another food pack from his bag and tossed it to her. "You eat too fast," almost choked back there. Karen looked down at the food in her hands. She had spent so many days starving that she had forgotten what it was like to eat without rushing. Carefully, she unwrapped the protein bar and took small bites this time. Daniel sat down on the chair across from her. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "All right, kid, tell me your story." Karen lowered her head. She didn't like talking about it. The memories hurt too much. "See Laurie," she whispered. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, I figured." She hesitated before continuing. "War came. My people lost. They left. I was too small." She didn't know the right words to explain it. Her family had tried to escape, but there had been no room left for her on the transport ship. She had watched them leave, disappearing into the stars. She had waited for them to return. They never did. Daniel exhaled through his nose. He didn't look surprised. "Yeah, I saw a lot of that during the war." Karen looked up. "You fought?" He nodded. "I was a soldier." Karen studied his face. The scar on his cheek, the way he always looked around like he expected an attack. It made sense now. He had seen battle. "Who did you fight for?" she asked. Daniel's eyes darkened for a moment before he leaned back in his chair. "For the wrong people, sometimes." Karen didn't understand. "You mean humans?" Daniel shook his head. "No, I mean people who thought winning was more important than doing what was right." He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I saw too many innocent people get left behind. Just like you." Karen's throat tightened. No one had ever talked to her like this before. No one had ever acknowledged what had happened to her people. Daniel stood up and grabbed a blanket from his bag. He tossed it onto the bed beside her. "Get some rest. You look like you haven't slept in days." Karen hesitated. I can stay." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You think I brought you here just to throw you back out?" She didn't answer, but a small part of her relaxed. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders, feeling warmth for the first time in a long while. Daniel sat back down and stretched his legs. "We'll figure things out in the morning." Karen curled up under the blanket. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel like she had to sleep with one eye open. She didn't know why this human had helped her. She didn't know if she could trust him completely. But for now, she was safe, and that was enough. Karen woke up slowly. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The blanket around her, the soft hum of the space station's ventilation, and the distant chatter outside the door. It all felt unfamiliar. Then she remembered. She was in the small room of a human soldier named Daniel Graves. She sat up quickly, her heart pounding. She had learned long ago never to sleep too deeply. The last time she had fallen asleep in the open, a group of station workers had thrown her out into the cold docking bays like she was garbage. But nothing happened this time. Across the room, Daniel sat on the chair, checking his wrist communicator. He looked up when he saw her moving. "Morning," he said, "or whatever time it is on this floating hunk of metal." Karen blinked. "You didn't leave." Daniel snorted. "Why would I?" She didn't answer. People always left. Daniel leaned forward and tossed her another food pack. "Eat." Karen hesitated, then unwrapped the bar. She forced herself to eat slowly this time. She still didn't understand why this human was helping her, but part of her didn't want to question it too much. If she did, he might change his mind. As she ate, Daniel tapped a few buttons on his wrist communicator, frowning. "Station news is quiet," he muttered. "That's not good." Karen tilted her head. "Why?" Daniel sighed and leaned back. "Because when a place like this goes quiet, it means something big is happening. And I've got a bad feeling it involves you." Karen tensed. "Me?" Daniel nodded. "You think it's normal for a Xilari kid to be running around alone on a Union-controlled station. No one else does. I saw the way people looked at you. It's not just fear. It's something worse." Karen lowered her eyes. She had felt it too. Daniel rubbed his chin. "You've been here a long time, right?" Karen nodded. "Ever seen other Xilari?" Karen shook her head. Not once. She had always thought it was because they had been hunted down after the war. But now, Daniel's words made her uneasy. Daniel stood up and grabbed his jacket. "Stay here," he said. "I need to find out what's going on." Karen gripped the blanket tighter. "You'll come back." Daniel looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a small nod. "Yeah, kid. I'll be back." Then he was gone. Daniel moved through the station's lower sectors, keeping his head low. The station had many levels. Shiny ones where rich traders and diplomats walked, and grimy ones where people like him ended up. He knew how things worked here. If someone wanted information, there was only one place to go: the black market hub. He reached a dimly lit bar filled with smugglers, bounty hunters, and criminals of all kinds. The air smelled of cheap fuel and spilled drinks. A few people glanced at him, but quickly looked away. Daniel walked straight to the back, where a four-armed alien was counting credits. "Graves," the alien muttered without looking up. "Haven't seen you in a while." "I need info, Jex," Daniel said. Jex sighed. "Info costs credits." Daniel placed a small credit chip on the table. "This enough?" Jex picked it up and scanned it. "Depends. What are you looking for?" Daniel leaned in. "The Xilari." Jex's four hands froze. His eyes flickered toward the guards at the door, then back to Daniel. "You should leave," Jex said quietly. Daniel narrowed his eyes. "That bad?" Jex leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "They're being erased." Daniel's stomach tightened. "Explain." Jex's hands trembled as he spoke. The war didn't end with a treaty. It ended with a purge. The Union decided the Xilari were too dangerous. They'd been tracking down the survivors, eliminating them. Daniel's jaw clenched. "And the ones on this station?" Jex swallowed hard. "There were a few years ago. But one by one, they disappeared. No records, no bodies, just gone." Daniel's fists tightened. He had seen a lot in his time as a soldier. But this was genocide. Jex looked at him carefully. "Why are you asking, Graves?" Daniel exhaled slowly. "Because I found one." Jex's face went pale. You need to get off this station. Now. Daniel's mind raced. He had known taking Karen in would be trouble, but this was bigger than he thought. The Union didn't just hate the Xilari. They were hunting them. And if anyone found out she was still alive, she wouldn't be for long. Without another word, Daniel turned and walked out of the bar, his heart pounding. He needed to get back to Karen. Fast, Daniel walked quickly through the crowded halls of Nova 17, his pulse steady but his mind racing. The moment Jex had told him about the Xilari purge, he knew Karen was in more danger than he had imagined. The Union wasn't just ignoring her kind. They were erasing them. And if anyone on this station found out she was still alive, she wouldn't be for long. He turned a corner, heading straight for his quarters. But before he reached the door, he noticed something. 2 Union security officers were walking down the hall, their armored boots clanking against the floor. They weren't looking for random criminals. Their eyes scanned every shadow, every doorway. They were searching for someone. Daniel clenched his fists. Too late. Someone already talked. He forced himself to walk normally, passing the officers without drawing attention. As soon as he reached his door, he pressed the code. The panel beeped, and the door slid open. Karen was sitting on the bed, gripping the blanket tightly. She looked up the moment he stepped in. Her eyes were wide, afraid. "You're back," she whispered. Daniel didn't waste time. He shut the door behind him and locked it. "We have to go. Now." Karen flinched. "Go." Daniel grabbed his bag and slung it over his shoulder. "Union security is looking for you." Karen's breathing became unsteady. "Why?" "I did nothing wrong." Daniel crouched in front of her, his voice firm but calm. "It's not about what you did, kid. It's about what you are." Karen swallowed hard. She wasn't sure what scared her more, the soldiers outside or the look in Daniel's eyes. She had seen many expressions in her life. Hate, disgust, indifference. But this was different. This was fear. Not for himself, but for her. Daniel pulled out a small device from his jacket and tapped a few buttons. The screen flickered, showing the ship schedules for the station. "Freighter Horizon Dawn is leaving in 30 minutes, he muttered. "Cargo ship. Quiet. No security checks." He looked at Karen. "We get on that ship. We disappear." Karen hesitated. She had spent years hiding in the dark corners of the station. Running was all she had ever known. But this time, it was different. She wouldn't be running alone. She gave a small nod. "Okay." Daniel stood up. "Then let's move." Outside, the search had already begun. The 2 security officers were now joined by 3 more, moving through the lower levels. Their leader, a tall man in a gray uniform, tapped his communicator. "We have confirmation," he said. "A Xilari was spotted near Sector 7. Orders." A cold voice answered through the device. "Find it. Terminate." The officer smirked. "Copy that." Daniel and Karen moved quickly through the station's back alleys. The bright, crowded areas were too risky. Here, in the dim maintenance tunnels, no one would notice them. Karen struggled to keep up with Daniel's fast pace, but she pushed herself forward. She had to. The closer they got to the docks, the more Daniel's instincts screamed at him. Something isn't right. He slowed down and pulled Karen into a dark corner. "Stay here." She tensed. "What?" He put a finger to his lips. Then, carefully, he peeked around the corner. Trouble. 5 security officers were blocking the entrance to the docking bay. They stood in formation, hands resting on their weapons. They weren't checking passengers. They were waiting for something, or someone. Daniel exhaled slowly. They know. He turned back to Karen. Change of plans. She looked up at him. "What do we do?" Daniel scanned the area. He had snuck into enemy bases before, but this was different. He wasn't trying to escape for himself. He had a scared kid depending on him. His eyes landed on a ventilation shaft above them. It was a tight fit, but it was their only chance. "Can you climb?" he asked. Karen hesitated, then nodded. Good. Daniel boosted her up, and she crawled inside. He followed, pulling the cover back into place. They moved slowly through the vents, careful not to make noise. Below them, the security officers waited. Minutes felt like hours. Sweat dripped down Daniel's face as he led the way through the maze of vents. If they took a wrong turn, they could end up trapped. Finally, Daniel spotted an opening. He peeked through and saw the docking bay. The Horizon Dawn was preparing to leave. Almost there, he whispered. He pushed open the vent cover and dropped down. Then he caught Karen as she climbed out. They sprinted toward the ship, blending into the workers carrying supplies. The loading ramp was closing. Daniel grabbed Karen's hand. Run. She ran, harder than she ever had before. The moment they reached the ramp, Daniel jumped, pulling Karen with him. They landed inside just as the doors sealed shut. The ship's engines roared. The docking bay disappeared as the freighter lifted off. They had made it. For the first time in years, Karen was leaving Nova 17. But as she looked up at Daniel, her heart still pounded. Because she knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The freighter Horizon Dawn rumbled as it left the station's orbit, its engines humming softly through the metal walls. Inside a dark storage compartment, Daniel and Karen crouched behind a stack of cargo containers, listening to the muffled sounds of the crew outside. Karen's small hands gripped the fabric of Daniel's jacket tightly. Her breathing was quick, her large eyes filled with both fear and confusion. For the first time in years, she wasn't trapped on Nova 17. But she wasn't safe yet. Daniel kept his hand close to his sidearm, listening. He knew this ship wasn't built for passengers. It was a cargo freighter, likely owned by independent traders. That meant the crew wouldn't check every corner of the storage bay, unless something went wrong. Karen finally spoke in a whisper. Where are we going? Daniel exhaled. Away from the station. That's the important part. Karen frowned. But where? Daniel didn't answer right away. He had spent years traveling between war zones, working for people who never cared about doing the right thing. He had never needed a real destination before. But Karen did. He finally said, There's a planet called Bastion. It's outside Union control. If we can get there, we'll be safe. Karen lowered her eyes. Safe. That word felt strange to her. She had never known what it was like to feel safe. The ship trembled slightly as it jumped to faster-than-light travel. Daniel relaxed a little. At least they weren't being chased. Yet. But then, something changed. A loud beep echoed through the cargo bay. A security scan. Daniel tensed. He recognized that sound. The ship's system was sweeping for unauthorized life signs. Karen grabbed his sleeve. What is that? Trouble, Daniel muttered. The scanner moved across the room, blinking as it read heat signatures. The moment it passed their hiding spot, it beeped twice. A warning. They had been detected. Him. Something isn't right. He slowed down and pulled Karen into a dark corner. Stay here. She tensed. What? He put a finger to his lips. Then, carefully, he peeked around the corner. Trouble. 5 security officers were blocking the entrance to the docking bay. They stood in formation, hands resting on their weapons. They weren't checking passengers. They were waiting for something. Or someone. Daniel exhaled slowly. They know. He turned back to Karen. Change of plans. She looked up at him. What do we do? Daniel scanned the area. He had snuck into enemy bases before, but this was different. He wasn't trying to escape for himself. He had a scared kid depending on him. His eyes landed on a ventilation shaft above them. It was a tight fit, but it was their only chance. Can you climb? He asked. Karen hesitated, then nodded. Good. Daniel boosted her up, and she crawled inside. He followed, pulling the cover back into place. They moved slowly through the vents, careful not to make noise. Below them, the security officers waited. Minutes felt like hours. Sweat dripped down Daniel's face as he led the way through the maze of vents. If they took a wrong turn, they could end up trapped. Finally, Daniel spotted an opening. He peeked through and saw the docking bay. The Horizon Dawn was preparing to leave. "Almost there," he whispered. He pushed open the vent cover and dropped down. Then he caught Karen as she climbed out. They sprinted toward the ship, blending into the workers carrying supplies. The loading ramp was closing. Daniel grabbed Karen's hand. "Run." She ran, harder than she ever had before. The moment they reached the ramp, Daniel jumped, pulling Karen with him. They landed inside just as the doors sealed shut. The ship's engines roared. The docking bay disappeared as the freighter lifted off. They had made it. For the first time in years, Karen was leaving Nova 17. But as she looked up at Daniel, her heart still pounded. Because she knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The freighter Horizon Dawn rumbled as it left the station's orbit, its engines humming softly through the metal walls. Inside a dark storage compartment, Daniel and Karen crouched behind a stack of cargo containers, listening to the muffled sounds of the crew outside. Karen's small hands gripped the fabric of Daniel's jacket tightly. Her breathing was quick, her large eyes filled with both fear and confusion. For the first time in years, she wasn't trapped on Nova 17. But she wasn't safe yet. Daniel kept his hand close to his sidearm, listening. He knew this ship wasn't built for passengers. It was a cargo freighter, likely owned by independent traders. That meant the crew wouldn't check every corner of the storage bay, unless something went wrong. Karen finally spoke in a whisper. "Where are we going?" Daniel exhaled. "Away from the station. That's the important part." Karen frowned. "But where?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He had spent years traveling between war zones, working for people who never cared about doing the right thing. He had never needed a real destination before. But Karen did. He finally said, "There's a planet called Bastion. It's outside Union control. If we can get there, we'll be safe." Karen lowered her eyes. Safe. That word felt strange to her. She had never known what it was like to feel safe. The ship trembled slightly as it jumped to faster-than-light travel. Daniel relaxed a little. At least they weren't being chased. Yet. But then, something changed. A loud beep echoed through the cargo bay. A security scan. Daniel tensed. He recognized that sound. The ship's system was sweeping for unauthorized life signs. Karen grabbed his sleeve. "What is that?" "Trouble," Daniel muttered. The scanner moved across the room, blinking as it read heat signatures. The moment it passed their hiding spot, it beeped twice. A warning. They had been detected. Are we going to crash?" Karen asked, her voice small and shaky. Daniel exhaled. "Not if I can help it." The pod wasn't designed for long travel. It was an emergency escape craft with limited fuel and oxygen. If they didn't find a safe place soon, they'd be stranded. Daniel checked the small screen on the dashboard. It showed a map of the nearby sector. He scanned it quickly, searching for any hope. His eyes narrowed. A small outpost was nearby, located on a large asteroid. It wasn't marked as Union territory. That meant it could be independent or dangerous. "Hold on," he muttered, adjusting the controls. The pod's thrusters fired weakly, pushing them toward the asteroid. Karen hugged her knees. "Will they follow us?" Daniel glanced at the scanner. No ships were chasing them. For now. "We got lucky," he said, "but we're not safe yet." Karen didn't reply. She just stared at the stars outside, her eyes full of uncertainty. A rough landing. The asteroid grew larger as they approached. It was a dark, rocky mass floating in the middle of nowhere, its surface uneven and jagged. Daniel gritted his teeth as the pod entered the thin atmosphere. Red warning lights flashed inside. System failure. Landing controls disabled. The pod started falling fast. Karen gasped, gripping her seat tightly. Daniel. Daniel cursed under his breath. If he couldn't slow them down, they would crash hard. Thinking fast, he pulled the manual override and fired the last bit of thruster fuel. The pod jerked, its descent slowing slightly, but not enough. With a violent jolt, they slammed into the asteroid's surface, skidding across the rocky ground before finally coming to a stop. For a moment, everything was silent. Karen slowly opened her eyes. Are we alive? Daniel groaned, rubbing his shoulder. Yeah, barely. He forced the door open, and cold air rushed inside. The sky above was a dull, starless black, with thick clouds of dust drifting across the horizon. The asteroid had a thin atmosphere, but it was breathable. Karen hesitated before stepping out, her small feet crunching on the rough ground. "What is this place?" she asked. Daniel scanned the area. In the distance, he saw a few lights. A settlement. "Looks like a trading post," he said. "Could be smugglers, miners, maybe worse." Karen swallowed. What if they don't like aliens? Daniel's jaw tightened. He had seen too much hatred in the galaxy. Too many people who looked at someone different and decided they didn't belong. He put a hand on her shoulder. "Let me do the talking." Karen nodded, trusting him. Together, they started walking toward the lights. The trader's outpost. The outpost was small and rough, built from old metal and scraps. Flickering neon signs lit the entrance, and a few figures in dusty coats stood outside, watching them. Daniel could tell they were armed, probably ex-mercenaries or criminals. A man with a metal eye implant stepped forward, crossing his arms. "New arrivals." His voice was deep and rough. Daniel kept his hands visible, showing he wasn't looking for a fight. "We need shelter, maybe a ship." The man smirked. "You got credits." Daniel didn't answer. He barely had anything left. The man chuckled. "Thought so." He turned his gaze to Karen. His smirk faded slightly. "What's this?" "Auxiliary." He narrowed his eyes. Didn't think there were any left. Karen froze, her heart pounding. Daniel stepped in front of her. "She's with me." The man stared at them for a long moment. Then he shrugged. "Not my problem." He motioned toward the outpost. "You want a place to stay. You'll have to work for it." Daniel nodded. "Fine." They followed him inside. The outpost was dimly lit and crowded, full of rough-looking people. Some sat at tables, drinking and talking in low voices. Others were checking weapons or repairing equipment. Daniel could feel the tension in the air. This was a place for people who didn't belong anywhere else. A woman with short silver hair sat behind a counter, typing on an old console. She looked up as they approached. The man with the metal eye nodded toward her. "They need a place to stay." She raised an eyebrow. "They got money?" "No," the man said. "But the guy looks like he can handle himself." The woman eyed Daniel. "You know how to fight." Daniel nodded. "Yeah." She tapped the console. "Good. We always need extra hands. You work, you eat. Simple as that." Daniel turned to Karen. "You okay with this?" Karen hesitated, but then nodded. She had spent her whole life hiding. Maybe it was time to stop running. A new beginning, or a new threat. That night, Daniel and Karen sat in a small room in the outpost. It wasn't much, just a metal bed and a table, but it was safe. For the first time in a long time, Karen didn't feel completely alone. Daniel sat across from her, checking his weapon. "We'll figure things out," he said, "one step at a time." Karen looked at him. "Do you think we'll ever be safe?" Daniel didn't lie to her. "I don't know, but I promise I won't let anything happen to you." Karen nodded, trusting him. But outside the room, in the shadows of the outpost, someone was watching. And soon, their past would catch up to them. The outpost was quiet at night. The flickering lights barely pushed away the darkness, and the metal walls creaked as the cold wind passed through the settlement. Inside their small room, Daniel sat by the door, his weapon resting in his hands. Karen lay curled up on the narrow bed, breathing softly. But Daniel couldn't sleep. something felt wrong. His instincts, sharpened by years of war, told him someone was coming. He stood up, his eyes scanning the room. The air was still, too still. Then, a faint sound outside. Footsteps, slow, careful, not friendly. Daniel moved quickly, placing a hand over Karen's shoulder. "Wake up," he whispered. Karen blinked, still half asleep. "What?" Daniel put a finger to his lips. "We need to go. Now." Karen sat up, fear creeping into her eyes. She knew better than to argue. Suddenly, the door burst open. A group of armed men stormed in, weapons raised. At the front stood Captain Vale, the scared leader of the freighter they had escaped from. His cold eyes locked onto them. "Thought you could run forever." Vale sneered. "You stole from me. You made me lose my cargo. And worst of all," he stepped forward, glaring at Karen, "you're protecting Axelari." Karen froze. Her whole life, she had seen that look. Hatred, disgust, anger. Daniel didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbing the nearest attacker and slamming him into the wall. The fight began. The battle in the outpost. The room erupted into chaos. Daniel moved like a soldier, knocking weapons aside, throwing punches, dodging attacks. Karen ducked under a wild swing and scrambled toward the door. She had to help. Vale aimed his blaster at Daniel. Karen's heart pounded. She grabbed a metal pipe from the floor and, with all her strength, swung it at Vale's arm. "Crikey!" Vale shouted in pain as the blaster fell from his grip. Daniel seized the chance. He grabbed Vale and threw him out of the room. "Run!" Daniel shouted. Karen didn't argue. She sprinted into the hallway, Daniel right behind her. But the outpost was waking up. More mercenaries were spilling into the corridors, drawn by the noise. Some joined the fight. Others just watched, waiting to see how things played out. Daniel and Karen ran through the maze-like outpost, dodging blaster fire and leaping over obstacles. Then, they reached a dead end. A locked door stood in their way. The only way out was behind them, where Vale's men were closing in. Karen spun around, breathing hard. "What do we do?" Daniel scanned the walls. Then he saw it. A vent. "Help me open this," he said. Karen grabbed the edges, her small hands trembling. Together, they ripped off the cover and crawled inside. The moment they disappeared, Vale and his men arrived. Vale glared at the empty hallway, his jaw tightening. Find them. The escape. Inside the vents, Karen and Daniel moved quickly. The metal was cold against their hands and knees, and every noise they made echoed through the passage. Karen's heart raced. "Where are we going?" she whispered. "There's a back entrance to the outpost," Daniel said. "If we can reach it, we can disappear." Karen nodded. She trusted him. They crawled forward, the voices of their pursuers fading behind them. Then they saw a light. A small opening led outside, onto a platform overlooking the asteroid's barren surface. Daniel kicked the vent cover off and climbed out first. He turned, reaching for Karen. "Come on." Karen grabbed his hand and jumped down. They landed softly, but before they could move, a gunshot rang out. Daniel spun around. Vale had found them. The captain stood at the entrance, his weapon aimed directly at Karen. "End of the road," Vale said. "Step aside. Soldier, this isn't your fight." Daniel stood his ground. "She's under my protection." Vale chuckled. "You think one man can change the galaxy?" Daniel's eyes hardened. "One man can make a difference." Vale pulled the trigger, but Daniel was faster. He dove forward, knocking Karen aside and firing his own weapon. The shot hit Vale square in the chest. The captain's eyes widened in shock. He staggered backward, his blaster slipping from his hand. Then he collapsed. The fight was over. A new future. The sun was rising over the asteroid's horizon. The outpost was far behind them now, nothing but a distant shadow. Daniel and Karen walked side by side, breathing in the cold air. Karen looked up at him. "Where do we go now?" Daniel smiled. "Bastion." Karen's eyes brightened. "Really?" Daniel nodded. "You deserve a home." Karen's heart swelled with emotion. For the first time in her life, she felt hope. She wasn't alone anymore. She had a friend, a protector, a family. And no matter what the galaxy threw at them, she knew one thing for sure: humans never abandon their own. They walked into the sunrise together.